Hello and welcome to the Cosmic Clinic podcast. I'm Christelle and I think this is the 7th episode and I'm quite excited about that because it means I've been consistent for about 7.5 weeks. Pretty cool. I'm quite proud of myself. Anyways, it is Mercury retrograde, so please be, I guess, I don't know, gentle on me. Don't judge me. I've got Mercury in Pisces. Currently, Mercury is retrograding in Pisces. I'm having a Mercury return. And yeah, it's taking me into the depths of the realms of the abstract world. And I'm not necessarily the most grounded. But anyways, that's a topic for another time. So today I want to just dive into the notion of cycles of success. Yeah. But before we dive into this, I always want to kind of encourage you to center your body, center your mind, your spirit, your soul, and just ground yourself into the present moment. Drop your shoulders, take a deep breath in. And if you can, breathe out as if you're breathing out through a straw. I love that. And relax into this episode. You don't have to take notes if you don't want to. If you do want to, great. I will be kind of like diving into some numbers and some descriptions. So I'm happy for you to take notes. But if you don't want to, please don't worry. You don't need to capture every concept, basically, is my point. In fact, if anything, I would encourage you to just listen carefully and slowly, gently, maybe as you relax, or maybe as you're, washing up or doing your day-to-day, taking a walk, maybe you're at work. But either way, I just want you to try and be in the present moment. Because, some of what I'm going to talk about today might resonate immediately. Some of it might just make sense later. Some of it may even just plant a seed. Either way, today I want to explore something that is incredibly important and not always discussed clearly in astrology, especially if we talk about ambition, entrepreneurship, and building something that's meaningful for our lives. So, like I said, I want to talk about the cycles of success. And one of the things I've noticed over the years is that people often judge themselves very harshly. This includes me, by the way. I'm not excluded from this. I'm human too. But we judge ourselves very harshly during certain phases of life. We look at a period where things feel slow or difficult and just naturally just go to assume that we are failing, or that somehow we're doing something wrong. But what's great about astrology is that it reminds us that life does not move in a straight line. And this is something my teacher used to stress a lot. My astrology teacher, he used to say, life is cyclical, guys. Remember, life moves in cycles. I was going to say circles. No, cycles. And there are seasons of expansion. There are seasons of consolidation, and there are seasons of testing, and there are seasons of redirections. They are essentially when you begin to understand those cycles, something quite interesting happens psychologically. You basically stop trying to interpret every difficult phase as a personal failure, because you're like, okay, I'm in this cycle now. I'm in the cycle of consolidation, or rather, maybe in this respect of testing, of being tested. Yeah. Or you're in a cycle of redirection. So literally instead, you begin to recognize that certain periods are designed to shape you, prepare you, or redirect you. And that's really important to bear in mind when we are starting a new project, when we are, even in a marriage, in a relationship, friendships, whatever life course we are experiencing in a moment in time is actually embedded or following a particular cycle. So, anyways, let me come back into it. So 3 of the most important cycles we can look at when thinking about long-term success and personal development are Saturn cycles, nodal cycles, and Jupiter cycles. Now, each of these represent a very different kind of timing. Let me expand, or let me elaborate. So Saturn represents structure and maturation. I think we probably know this right by now. I mean, very often we link Saturn to just hardship and just discipline and slowing things down. But essentially, he's about structure and maturation. The nodes represent direction and purpose, and Jupiter represents expansion and opportunity. And when we understand how these 3 cycles move through our lives, we begin to see a much clearer picture of our personal evolution. Now let's start with Saturn, because Saturn is often the planet people fear the most, right? Saturn has a reputation of being difficult, restrictive, even punishing. But when you look at Saturn through a psychological lens rather than a fatalistic one, we begin to see a much more interesting energy that emits from Saturn. In that Saturn is essentially asking us to grow up. Grow up. And not in the sense of becoming serious or losing joy, but in the sense of developing inner authority. Saturn cycles are essentially about maturation. And the most famous Saturn cycle, which I'm sure you've heard throughout your life at some point, is the Saturn return, which happens roughly around the age of 29 to 30, sometimes a little bit earlier. And this is the moment when Saturn returns to the same position it occupied at the moment we were born. But the Saturn cycle actually begins much earlier than that. We do experience the impact of Saturn much earlier than that. In that the first major Saturn milestone happens around age 14 or 15, and this is when Saturn forms its most significant position in the sky relative to your birth chart. I wonder if you can think back to that kind of age group, or even if you've got children around that age group, or anybody who's 14, 15, and what kind of attitudes they have towards the world. So if you think about that age psychologically, it does make sense, doesn't it? That's essentially when us teenagers start to begin questioning authority, questioning identity, questioning who we are becoming, essentially. And then around 21, Saturn forms another key phase in its cycle, and many people experience a shift from this time related to independence, responsibility, and direction, which is very interesting because there's a lot of things that we can finally do at 21 that we couldn't do when we were younger. So, and that's all across various countries and things like that. But I think you might be able to relate to this. So, what did I want to say next? Yeah, so by the time we reach by the time we reach the Saturn return at 29 or 30, Saturn is essentially asking a very important question. And the question is simple because, Saturn is kind of simple, but it's profound. That's also Saturn's energy. And the question is, have you built a life that reflects who you actually are? Or have you been living according to expectations that don't truly belong to you? For many of us, the Saturn return is a period where careers change, relationships shift, and priorities become clearer. And from a neuroscience perspective, I find this very interesting, is that this timing is fascinating because it roughly coincides with the full maturation of the prefrontal cortex in the brain, the prefrontal cortex being the front part of the brain. And this part of the brain is essentially responsible for long-term planning, impulse control, Saturn's domain is control, and decision making. In other words, around the time of the Saturn return, both astrologically and neurologically, people are entering a stage where they are capable of making more deliberate and conscious life decisions, and decisions that affect us long term. How interesting is that? So, when we think about success cycles, Saturn is not about rapid growth. Saturn is about building something that lasts. And entrepreneurs often experience Saturn periods as moments where they must refine their systems, strengthen their foundations, and confront weaknesses in their strategies. It can feel frustrating in the moment, laborious in a lot of ways, but Saturn periods often produce the most sustainable results. Now, let's contrast that energy with Jupiter, the planet that everybody loves, because Jupiter does operate in a very different fashion. Jupiter represents expansion, optimism, opportunity, growth, and Jupiter takes approximately 12 years to travel around the zodiac, which means that every 12 years it returns to the same place it was when we were born. And Jupiter cycles often coincide with periods of increased opportunities, visibility, and exploration. And very often we experience Jupiter periods as times when doors open more easily, new ideas emerge, travel becomes more likely, and educational opportunities appear. So if Saturn asks you to consolidate and mature, Jupiter invites us to explore and expand. But there is an important nuance here. Jupiter expansion without Saturn structure can become chaotic. And Saturn structure without Jupiter expansion can become quite rigid. So the real magic happens when these two forces are working and collaborating together. A good example of this in entrepreneurship might be someone who has spent several years building a solid foundation for their work and then suddenly enters a Jupiter period where opportunities begin to multiply. Because they have had already develop the discipline and the structure that Saturn requires, and they are able to handle that expansion effectively. Now, let's talk about the nodal cycles, which are slightly different from the Saturn and Jupiterian energy. The lunar nodes represents the intersection points between the orbit of the moon and the path of the sun. And in astrology, they are often associated with themes of destiny, direction, and evolution. The nodal cycle lasts about 18 and a half years, and this means that roughly every 18 and a half to 19 years, the nodes return to the same position they occupied when we were born. So these nodal returns often correspond with the moments when we begin questioning whether the direction that we are moving in still feels meaningful. And around 18 or 19 years of age, we often feel the urge to step into independence and explore our own identity. And around 37 to 38, the second nodal return happens. And this is where we experience a deep reassessment of our purpose, our work, and our priorities. And what makes the nodal cycle interesting is that often it feels less structured than Saturn and less optimistic than Jupiter. It feels more like a turning point in life. And the questions it tends to ask is whether we are moving in a direction that truly belongs to us, or if we are repeating patterns that no longer fit who we are becoming. Now, for entrepreneurs and creators, nodal cycles can coincide with major pivots. A business might evolve into something entirely different, for example, or a person might realize that their work needs to serve a deeper purpose than it once did. And this brings us to something very important. Success is not simply about working harder or pushing ourselves further. Success often depends on whether we or our actions are aligned with the natural cycles of growth, consolidation, and redirection that life represents. Now, if we are trying to expand aggressively during a Saturn consolidation phase, we may feel constant resistance. And if we are trying to remain stable and cautious during a Jupiterian phase, or a Jupiter expansion phase to be more precise, we may miss opportunities. Astrology does not remove free will, but it does offer insight into timing. And timing, as many entrepreneurs eventually discover, is one of the most important factors in success. I'm sure you would agree. So, There are seasons where we build quietly. There are seasons where we refine our craft. There are seasons where the world suddenly becomes more receptive to what we have been creating. And understanding these seasons can change the way we interpret our experiences, particularly in the context of business, entrepreneurship, but even in relationships, family dynamics, and so on and so forth. So, understanding the seasons is super important. And instead of thinking, why is this so difficult right now? You might want to ask, what is this phase asking me to develop? And sometimes the answer is patience. Sometimes it's courage. Sometimes the answer is discipline, or sometimes it's like vision. Sometimes you need more vision. So be more creative, And when you begin to see your life through the lenses of cycles rather than linear progress, you often become far less harsh with yourself, far less self-critical with yourself, more patient. And you start recognizing that growth is not constant. It pulses. It moves like breath. You expand, you contract, and you expand again. Now, if you are currently in a phase that feels slower or more demanding, it does not necessarily mean that you're off track. It might simply mean that you're in a Saturn phase where foundations are being strengthened. So keep going. Have patience. And if you are experiencing sudden opportunities and new directions, you may be in a Jupiter season where expansion is possible. And if you feel an inner pull towards a different path altogether, the nodal cycle may be inviting you to reconsider your direction. Now, I think I've made my point clear here. The seasons are important, especially around business and entrepreneurship. But before we finish this conversation today, I want to leave you with something to reflect on. Think about the last 10 years of your life. Were there periods where things seemed to grow quickly and naturally? Were there periods where you felt challenged, tested, or forced to mature? Were there moments where your sense of direction changed completely? If you look back at those periods, not as random events, but as part of the larger cycles, what might you learn about your own timing? Because one of the most empowering things about astrology that I love is that it can offer the understanding that life is not simply a sequence of success and failures. It is a series of phases, and each phase is preparing you for the next one. Thank you for thinking through this conversation with me today. I'll speak to you soon in the next episode. With so much love, Christelle.